Welcome back to Novel Writing 101, the 21-week course where I teach you how to write the first draft of your novel. Today I'm going to give you some tips and advice on chapters, so let's get into it. So it's week 8 of the course and week 4 of section B, writing and execution. You should be well into your first draft at this point, but I still want to give you some tips to help you along the way. So today we're going to talk about chapters, specifically length, variety, and their endings. Now, regardless if you chose to do a more structured outline style where you know exactly what your chapter should look like, or you're more of a pantser and you kind of just sit down and show up every day and see what you write, it's good to keep in mind what your chapters look like when you put them back to back to back. First, let's talk about chapter length. Now, chapter length is heavily determined by one, what needs to happen in the chapter, and your execution. If you're leaning into discovery writing at times, you could find that a chapter is much longer or much shorter than you thought it would be. And during your first draft, you don't have to worry about this too much. However, it's good to keep in mind what your chapters are looking like lengthwise, so you know, okay, in my first draft, chapter 1 is about 2,000 words. Chapter 2 is much shorter, it's about 500 words. And then chapter 3 goes into 7,000 words. Now, when you keep this in mind, you might start thinking, okay, well, when I do my first round of editing, I might have to cut up that 7,000 word chapter to be more digestible for my readers. And just because I want to have it more impactful where people are ready to turn the page to the fresh chapter. Again, these are all things you can worry about in editing, but it is good to keep in mind when you're going through your first draft of how everything is turning out. Now, getting into chapter variety, this is something you have much more control of in the first draft and that you should be really thinking about. When I say chapter variety, I'm talking about one specific thing, and that's how are you starting your chapter. If you're realizing that every single time you start a chapter, you're starting with a description, you might want to rethink. And that's not to say that you can't do that. I'm just saying variety is, to be cheesy, the spice of life. Variety is what, in a book, helps keep your readers engaged and excited to learn more about the story. So when you're starting a new chapter, maybe look at the one before briefly, don't go back and edit, but look at it briefly and say, okay, I'm working on chapter 8 now, but chapter 7, I started with a description of what the scene is and like where this story is taking place in this moment. Maybe I want to start it a little differently. Maybe I want to start with dialogue right off the bat. Or maybe I just want to start with a different word. Maybe all of my chapters start with the. Maybe it says, the land was rough and rugged. Or maybe it says, the wind blew. You know what I mean? Like, if you're starting the chapter the same way every time, it's good to realize that now and start mixing it up and even pushing yourself out of your comfort zone in the first draft to add that variety. The last thing we're going to talk about in terms of chapters are the endings. Chapter endings are very key because they keep your readers on the edge of their seat and flipping to the next page. A good chapter ending can be the difference between a reader saying, okay, that's it for tonight, I'm going to close the book and go to bed, or staying up until 2 a.m. reading. Now, of course, you can refine all of this in edits, but it's good to keep in mind how you're ending your chapters and try to be as impactful as possible. For instance, maybe there's one piece of dialogue that really nails the chapter ending and has readers just kind of like taken aback or like really intrigued and ready to learn more. Maybe it was a hint of a plot twist, or a character has come back and they say one impactful thing that really throws the main character's perspective off. And it can even be a lot simpler than that. Maybe you're on this journey with your characters and they've just overcome something, and maybe you end the chapter with something the main character has learned that again has shifted their perspective or given them new insight to what they're going to have to face in the future. Again, the goal of chapter endings is to be as impactful as possible. You want the reader to either feel like they're on the edge of their seat and they need to turn the page and read the new chapter, or that they've just come away with reading this past chapter and have some strong sense of where the story is going or some sense of moral ideals or perspective from the main character. As an example, I'm going to read a chapter ending from one of my books to give you an idea of how this can be done. It's an amazing place, Savvy raves. You have to go at least once, just to try the ale. She carries on, but her words fade into the background of my thoughts once more. I stare out into the desert, into the blank expanse of nothing that I so desperately want to disappear into. 5 days. I just need to survive the next 5 days. And if Rowan finds me before then, I clench my teeth and push away the thought. I can only hope my suffering does not bring anyone else's with it. So that was an example of something that kind of gives you a sense of, okay, the main characters just come away from all that's happened in this last chapter and learned something or gained a new perspective or has a feeling, whether that be good or bad, about what the future holds. But I want to read you one more example that gives a more on the edge of your seat vibe where the reader wants to flip to the next page. Tariq let out a breathy laugh. 7 against 1? I'm not worried. Hassan looks at Vish, no doubt noting the same quiet distress I see in the man's eyes. Be prepared for anything, Hassan orders. And anyone. Again, the goal here is to be impactful, have the reader on the edge of their seat, or feel like they've taken something away from what they've just learned. And like those examples, it doesn't have to be the most profound thing you've ever written. You don't have to end each chapter with some over-the-top grandiose prose or something that is a pull quote. It can just be something that, again, wraps up the chapter, the vibe, the feeling, the danger, the excitement, the plot twist, and guides us into the new chapter. So there you have it. There's our quick discussion on chapters, specifically length, variety, and endings. If you guys have any additional questions, please feel free to drop me a comment. Next week will be our first accountability check, so be prepared for that. Make sure you're actually writing and saying what you said you'd do in your personal contract. Until then, happy writing, and I'll see you next time.